Hi, everyone. I want to take a few minutes to welcome you all here. Such a great opportunity to be in community with you. Before I have our guests introduce themselves, I just want to tell you the story of how we are all connected and why it's important for us to be together today. My name is Mel Fillmore. I'm a second-year PhD student from Boise State University in the School of Public Service. I'm studying public policy and administration. My focus being U.S. policy on American Indigenous peoples, and conversely, how American Indigenous people are participating in public policy. And I really want to share my relationship to my colleague and one of my dearest friends, Hanako Wakatsuki. Her friendship is one of the most important of my life, and what's interesting is my relationship with her is directly tied to our ancestral history with regard to U.S. policy, removing our communities and impacting our, the way our citizenship is configured in the United States. And one specific point is that one of the authors of the War Relocation Authority, the author of those policies, Dylan S. Meyer, became in charge of the BIA and was in charge of the termination and relocation. And so the policies related to termination and relocation of terminating American Indian status and tribes and removing them to cities is the sister policy to the same. It is the same administrative policy that removed Japanese American people to internment camps and sites on federal land, which was often indigenous land. And through Hanako, we've connected so much on the story of our ancestors living through those experiences. The purpose of today is to honor and recognize all marginalized communities who experience state oppression. And we recognize state oppression as a global phenomenon, communicating economic and political, historical, and social, spiritual ways marginalization and oppression has shaped humanities and collective experiences. And it requires a deep commitment to conversations and a continual practice of acknowledging our lived experiences with marginalization. Our panel hopes to move through the settler colonial tools of internal divisions and state policies and categorizations that often place communities in deep and harmful places that exacerbate collective pain and trauma. And one thing our panel hopes to do is to serve as an experience toward collective solidarity, where we can communicate the stories and the history of oppression across our communities into a future place. And we envision truth and justice rooted in the stories of our ancestors and shared, and that our stories of the ways our communities have been impacted by state oppression. And so it is with great pleasure and honor that I am spending time with these community of folks, and I'd really like our panelists to introduce themselves and the communities that they come from. So Alisha, if you want to start.
Hi, thank you, Mel. My name is Alisha Deegan. I'm a citizen of the Mandan Hidatsa-Rikura Nation in North Dakota, and I work for the National Park Service at Knife River Indian Village's Natural Historic Site.
Albert, do you want to take a...
Thanks. My name my name's Albert LeBeau. I'm an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe in South Dakota. I'm currently the acting tribal liaison for the Office of American Indian Affairs for DOI 3, 4, and 5. And my real job is the Cultural Resource Program Manager at Effigy Mountains National Monument. I do apologize. I have a bit of a frog in my throat. So,
thank you, Albert. Take it away, Dorothy.
Okay, all right, thank you. My name is Dorothy Firecloud, and I am a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe from South Dakota. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and my most recent job within the National Park Service is that of Native American Affairs Liaison, which is an assistant position to the director of the National Park Service. And I've been in this position for almost a year, and prior to that, I was superintendent at Montezuma Castle and Tuzigoot National Monuments in Arizona, and then Devil's Tower National Monument in Wyoming before then. So it's good to be here.
Thank you all. So, and it's also such a pleasure to be with not just tribal folks that are working in federal positions, and it's just such a pleasure to be with folks, Indigenous people who are working in these positions, and folks from my own tribal homelands. I'm Hunkpapa Lakota from Standing Rock Sioux tribe on the South Dakota side. And so my first question for you all is, how do we recognize our own stories in the stories of other community oppressions?
Okay, so I think, as you're growing up, you kind of hear stories about what's going on, but you don't really recognize how you might be impacting one another. And I think it really came to bear most recently for me, when all of the stories started coming out with the Asian Americans being attacked, and a lot of it having to do with COVID and stuff. And I think I started really thinking about it more from that point of view. And at the same time, working with, I've been a member of CIRCLE, which is the Employee Resource Work Group within the National Park Service for tribal NPS employees. And we had recently been working with the employee work group that was being developed for Asian Americans. And so we've been working together very closely the last, I'm thinking, like 2 years. Alisha can talk about that a little bit more because she was pretty involved with it. But one of the days I was reading up and kind of getting a little bit more depth into the boarding school initiative and all that's going on with that. And then just going back and looking at some of the boarding schools. And there was a story that had popped up about one of the former boarding schools that had buildings that had been used, had also been used to house for the Japanese Americans when they were interned. And just thinking about the trauma that was left within that building originally from having those young kids be there, in the boarding school era. And then, so there's all of that trauma that's left in that building. And then, they're all removed. And then this whole other group of minority people are brought in, being traumatized, by being taken away from their homes and their businesses and everything over something that they had no control over. And then being put into this building that already has all of this trauma that had been a part of its history. And then I was thinking from a grandmother's perspective and going into those kind of buildings and being able to feel all of that trauma that had originally happened there. And then that being kind of compounded upon the trauma that they're already going through originally, by being removed from their homes and stuff. It was just, it's just really difficult when you start thinking about all the things that minority people have had to go through. So
I also think part of it is that, we were the original, the Native Americans or American Indians, we were the first ones to be marginalized. Mm-hmm. You start from looking at Meadowcroft, in the Maritimes in Canada, and you go all the way to what happened to the California tribes, and then even further than that to the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islands as well. They practiced on us until they got it right to do it to other people. The ideas of internment camps came from the idea of putting us on reservations. that was a direct correlation on, American policy towards those who are different than the norm, or what is perceived to be the norm. And, it is a shared trauma. And, when we think about that, it is, they, like I said, they practice on us first. And yet we survived, just as other marginalized, quote unquote, marginalized populations have survived. And that is, one of the benefits of being a marginalized group, is that we have survived, and we will continue to survive, going into the next century.
To think about your question is, how do we recognize our own stories in this time of oppression? That's a huge thing, and I feel like as Indigenous people, we know our stories, we recognize it, but there's also that was set in place that Albert and Dorothy were talking about, is that removal, that policy to destroy our culture as Native people. And it is in that concept, in that idea, is why we do the work we do within the Park Service, is to help put those stories out there of the oppression, to tell the full history of where we're at these sites and what that means, what that looks like, going all the way back to who was on this land to begin with. And having the ability and the responsibility as managers and as leaders, we need to tell those stories, in all of them. And just because they will feel uncomfortable to people, it is good to sit in some uncomfortableness to actually make some positive change. And I appreciate this platform to be able to speak to other people that understand what that means and what that looks like, so that we can go forward together to create a place where that next generation will not have to go through what we are going through, just like the people before us. It makes it easier every single time. So that's a really good question.
Yeah, thank you all for this. One of the things I think when I think of the places that we do share these stories, I often think of sitting with my aunties, or in ceremony, or sitting with relatives who are about to go through Sundance, or those are the sacred places where we often hear the hardest stories of our, the trials that our ancestors went through. And I, wasn't until, being in college, and again, talking with Hanako, and learning about the practice of pilgrimages, where her community gets to come to these places of the land of the trauma, of the places where this stuff was perpetrated, and that history to be revisited, but to be contextualized over and over again, is such a practice that I am so inspired by, the historic preservation work, but also letting the people who have experienced that firsthand, and the families, right, because we carry those stories with us, and our children carry those stories with us throughout. And I really appreciated Dorothy's comment, reflecting on being a grandmother, and tying your story through, that this isn't just one generation, it impacts multiple generations. That's something I also appreciate about the Japanese American preservation experience. It's about their younger generations being told that history, and that history being shared with them as well. And one of the most important things that I think came out of our group chat when we first met was the collective experiences we've had, not only knowing our ancestral histories, but knowing that the work that we do I'm in academia, but the rest of you are in National Park Service and doing this work, is your collective just knowledge navigating these systems, and it can be really hard. And so the next question that I have is, Alisha brought this up, was, a huge motivating factor in why we still continue to do this work, even in the face of oppression, and ask you to, what do you, how do you feel about that, and how do you navigate that, that work?
I'll let one of the youngsters take the lead on this one.
Can you repeat the question?
Why do we still do this in the face of so much oppression?
Because Dorothy said I had to.
Auntie said so. Auntie Dorothy here.
Yeah. Well, I think it really is because of the fact that, we're getting ready to do November, which is Native American Month coming up. And so we were talking about different themes and what we should do and stuff. And Albert, kind of came up with a really good idea because, when we're in these positions, we're really walking in two worlds, and it does get difficult, because I remember one time being in a meeting in Santa Fe, and this is when I worked with U.S. Forest Service as a regional liaison down there. And they had like breakout rooms for everybody to go to. And so, I wanted to go into one of these rooms, but the breakout rooms were like for the tribal folks. And so, I still, I'm a federal employee, but I'm Native. I'm a member, the Rosebud tribe. And so, I went into one of the meetings and was told, you really can't be here because you're a Fed. And, so you get that kind of a pushback. But at the same time, we all recognize how important it is to have Native people working inside, so that we can push telling the stories, helping tribal people not be invisible any longer. And when we do, I just got off listening to a tribal consultation meeting that was going on before I joined you guys, and the fact it was one of the things that was mentioned was it wasn't until 1924 that tribal people were even recognized to be human. We were considered subhuman or not before 1924, and it wasn't until different laws were passed, and then it wasn't until like in the 1960s almost before we were able to vote and stuff. And so from that point of view, and then we're working with Illuminative right now to try to develop a partnership of how we can work together to help tell the stories beyond the wars, beyond the Indian wars of tribal people, the fact that we're still here. And within the National Park Service, we have a lot of signage where you'll go into parks and there'll be a sign that will say, we're still here, and talk a little bit about the tribes that are located around the park or within the park, and talk about the consultations that we're doing. But then we stop. We're not good at telling the current stories of tribal people, the contemporary stories of tribal people, how successful, a lot of tribal people are, how successful a lot of tribes are. The fact that, we only have one park unit that even comes close to being able to tell that story, which is Alcatraz. And Alcatraz, there's nothing within its legislative history that says anything about tribal people, but yet Alcatraz has a rich history of tribes and different events. The one that's known the most is the occupation that happened. But even there, we talk about the occupation and what happened during that time, but we don't talk about what resulted of that occupation. The fact that President Nixon was in office, the fact that he had a football coach in college that was Native, that influenced how he looked at Indian people. So when he was in office, he was able to change a lot of things. You know, a lot of people don't like Nixon because of what happened and stuff, but when you look at what all he did for Native people, it's pretty rich, and it really turned the history of this country and how, you know, up until that time, it was all about termination. You know, so there's a lot of people going into the cities, you know, taking adults, Native American adults from reservations and putting them to all these different cities throughout the country and hoping that they would just become mainstream, and then eventually the reservations would go away. Just like with blood quantum, you know, blood quantum is something that's really argued amongst tribal people, but it's a colonialistic approach of getting rid of tribal people, because there's no other race of people that has to show how much, what, like dogs or horses. This is my degree of blood, you know, in order to be a member of this tribe. But yet we have internalized that so much that a lot of people then say, well, you're not full blood, you're only half blood. So then you have, to deal with all of that back home and stuff. And so, we need to remember that as tribal people. But going back to Alcatraz, so what happened as a result of Alcatraz was the fact that Nixon then turned it to become self-determination. But we need to tell that story there. So that's one of the things that we're working on, is to start telling more of those stories. We're doing an internal gap analysis to see where we're missing parts, what stories are we not telling, and it's everything tribal, beginning with the end of the Indian Wars forward, that we still need to tell. So.
I was going to say that through my experience of why we still do this, and I know it's kind of a very personal, like everybody, we each have our own reason why we stick in here, and I think we've all had that discussion of, or I should rephrase that. We've all had one of us talk each other down from saying, I've had enough. Because it gets to a point where you get really jaded. And so remembering why you still do this work, and it's for that future generation, and to honor the people that came before us and the work they did. And so when I give my 1-minute elevator speech to those younger generations that are coming up, it's that. It's like, there's going to be days where you're just like, what am I doing? And then you're going to remember all of the people, and just going back even hundreds of thousands of years. We're here because of them, and we have to continue. And that was something my husband said to me the other night, because it's been such a difficult, just even this week has been so difficult. And he's like, when our ancestors left the villages here that I'm at my site after smallpox, because of the hurt and the pain that they had lived through those years before they went, he's like, we are the answers to their prayers. Now here's one of the tribal members as the superintendent of this site, and we're living here. And it's like that right there, that we can say this to the people, like, here we are. And when you talked about Hanako and her position, like, how powerful is that for us as Indigenous people, as people of color, that we can say we're sitting in these positions, that we can help now change the policy, change the way things happen, so that that next generation, the generation after, don't have it as hard as we did. And so that is why I stay here, even after some crazy stuff happens at work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for sharing. I keep thinking about, I am really interested in the way that data shapes what policy says about American Indian people. And, one of the ways that's configured is, of course, census data, and the census data says, just Native American people. And one of the things that data says is that 75% of Native people live in cities. And it's like, that doesn't say anything about where people have come from. It doesn't say anything about our individual communities. And what's fascinating to me is, and what I'm hearing from all of you is that deep connection to your ancestral homelands and that collective knowledge that you bring to the work that you do now is such a part of that story. And that's not the story that's told in mass data, right? And these national ways of being and knowing, right? And so I've always wanted to see people like me working in spaces, and I'm always interested in how they made that happen, right? And so my third question is directly tied to this, like who is an ancestor that has inspired your current work in your life path?
I would have to say it's probably my grandmother. My grandmother raised us down by the river. No running water, no electricity, none of the amenities that we have today. And I mean, she did an awesome job. She still impacts the way that I do things today, mostly by scaring me. There were so many of us that when we were little that she would use spirits and ways, have fear in us and stuff. And every so often I'll do something, I'll remember, oh my gosh, I'm still, she's still controlling, how I'm behaving today and making sure I'm not doing something really stupid stuff. So, yeah, so I'd have to say for me, it's my grandmother and stuff.
I think for me, I walk in the shadows of my ancestry. And, I come from a long lineage of great people, and the fact that they were able to survive, and in some cases not survive. I have relatives that are buried at Wounded Knee. I have relatives who are part of the Dakota 38. And it's even up into my parents' generation. My parents were the first people from my reservation to get their post-baccalaureate degrees, and my dad was the first one to get his PhD. So I walk in the shadow of those people, and that's what inspires me to keep going, because in my opinion, there's a saying, we try to be humble, and for me, I'm humbled by my ancestry, and I'm humbled by my parents, my grandparents, my great grandparents, great greats, great great greats, great 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 greats, and for me, that's what keeps me going. And then also, I'm a grandparent, so I have to look after and prepare the world for my grandchildren as they grow up, and as they're mixed race, and as they grow up and understand that they are going to be walking in two worlds, whether they like it or not.
I guess I would have to say, along with both of Dorothy and what Albert say, it's there's so many people that are still alive, and then people that are not, along with my grandpas that really have influenced me. And I had a dream like 10 years ago, and this dream is when I was at Mount Rushmore, and the superintendent at the time is an individual from my tribe. And in the dream, he had this huge fire in the middle of his office that just certain people were helping to keep going. And I had come to him, and he was talking about going up to North Dakota to help with an archaeological dig that was along the Knife and then the Heart River. And I said, that's our people. He's like, and I asked him, can I go? And he didn't answer at first. And then I asked again, and he said, yes, you can go, but you have to do these things. So it wasn't then until 4 years later that I moved to this site. So I feel like I've always had my ancestors watch over me, but I've had individuals in my life that have provided opportunities, and those lessons that I've learned from my grandparents is to be thankful and take advantages of those opportunities when you can.
Yeah, thank you. I would say that my father was removed from his mother, and my father is half Native, half white, and was removed from the reservation away from my grandmother when he was 3, at a time when she had no rights to, they didn't recognize, the rights of Indigenous mothers, especially if you were unmarried. And so no way for her to have a relationship with my father. And he didn't end up going back until much later in life. And what's interesting is my grandmother ended up working for ICWA, bringing children back home to our reservation. And when I think about that story and her life experience, she was a mother who had lost her children in that, and to be able to return children to families, knowing firsthand that experience of what it meant to lose your children and to be able to bring that. ICWA, yes, thanks. Thank you, Albert. ICWA is the Indian Child Welfare Act, which previous to 1970, it was legal for American Indian children to be adopted off the reservation or away from families. So if the state deemed families incapable of caring for their children, which at the time was, there are a lot of issues with that, with the removal of children, American Indian children, from their families, and which is also a state adoption, a state process, right, of recognizing humanity of Indigenous children. And what's also interesting about ICWA and the connection to, I'm not sure if any of you are aware of this. I only became aware of this very recently, but even Japanese American orphan children were removed to internment camps. And so the idea that the identification of children and removing children from spaces that the state deemed necessary is still, and when we think about our politics of removing families from children and our borders, these are all connected policies that have been administrative, patterns, right? That are the state is engaged in. So thank you, Albert. I think my favorite question that I would like to ask you all is, what do you want to share about your work experiences to folks that they might not know about your job or your work or your experiences?
I don't know if we have enough. I don't know if there's enough time.
Oh, we got 30 minutes left.
I'll defer to a person who is older than I.
Okay. Yeah. State your question again, so I make sure I get it all right.
Yeah. What do you wish people knew about your work that they might not know?
Oh, God. I mean, how interesting it is. I think, and not only how interesting, but how valuable it can be at different times to helping tribal people move forward with what needs to be done. As a whole, we, I think probably my favorite part of the job throughout my career is helping Native people come into the Park Service and helping to make sure that we help one another. But also within the National Park Service, there's a lot of youth programs. And through the youth programs, I think that we're able to make quite a bit of difference within a lot of Native people's lives, especially Native youth, because I mean, with the rate of suicide and the hopelessness that people can feel at times and stuff, I think that those programs can really make a difference in how they approach life at times. And I think being able to make progress within the National Park Service by helping a lot of the tribal youth also reconnect to places. I said earlier that I had served as superintendent at Devil's Tower National Monument, which is a significant sacred area. The whole entire Black Hills is a significant site or area landscape for tribal people. But we worked with the Forest Service, and we would bring in youth crews every summer and stuff. And part of it, we would make sure that they would get that they weren't working like 8 hours a day and stuff. But we also made sure that they were able to enjoy the park and get some educational value. So we would take them around and do different things with them and stuff. And I really hope that a lot of those opportunities for the youth have made a difference in their lives and stuff. And I think that's one of the things that that people don't really think about as much. And there's a new program that's coming up, the Indian Youth Service Corps, that just passed last year. And that's specific to Native American youth, Native Hawaiians, and South Pacific Islanders to help get youth crews coming back into the parks that will be specific for direct hire authority for the Native Americans, Native Hawaiian, and Southern Pacific Islander youth to work in the parks. And I'm really looking forward to that. We're getting ready to publish the implementation guidance here soon. And then really looking forward to how we can get that funding out to the different communities. And there's a lot of different the conservation corps, that are working with the parks. The Ancestral Lands crew is one that's, I think, making a huge difference in a lot of young people's lives and stuff. So I think from that perspective that we're really making a positive difference too. But it's something that people don't really see that, that we're working on and stuff, but it's kind of, it's there.
I think part of my issue is that I joke around a lot because that's who I am. But usually when I do introductions at meetings or if I'm giving a class, I introduce myself as a walking oxymoron or just a moron. And the reason I say that is because I'm a Native American archaeologist. Archaeology in Indian country, isn't looked upon very well when I first started. It's getting way better now, but when I first started, way back when, I've been called a trained pot hunter on my council floor by my relatives who wanted me to go to college to get my degree in archaeology. So, and the thing that helps me, or the thing that is kind of surprising for people to find out, is in both the positions that I have now, I actually get to be an advocate for tribes. The role that I look at is I'm in place, whether I'm the cultural resource program manager, making sure that we follow our consultation mandates under the law, versus as a Native American liaison, I get to advocate for our tribes to ensure that we, the National Park Service, are living up to our words, which are the law, that we are following the law. Because of that historic trauma that I have with that my ancestors had to deal with broken treaties, and the government not being honest with them ever. And my working for my tribe before I worked for the Park Service, and fighting with the government and making sure that they followed the law. When I used to work for the tribe, I always used to tell that whatever agency I worked for or was working against was, these are your words, not mine. You have to follow your words. Because if it was up to me, I'd do it a different way, but these are your words. So you will follow the law or we will sue you. So on the other side of it, I said, these are our words. If we don't follow our words, they're going to turn around and sue us. So what do you want us to do? It's your decision, but here are the options, and that is what I get to do now. And that is probably one of the more surprising things, even to myself anymore, is that I get to do that. So.
I don't know if there's anything really too surprising, but the things that I really like about the job that is not something that you would associate with the position that I am right now, maybe more the employee resource group that we are a part of, which is the Council for Indigenous Relevance, Communication, Leadership, and Excellence, also known as CIRCLE, is that reaching out and being that safe space for other Native people, because it can get really isolating in the parks that you're at. You may be the only person of color maybe even in the town that you live at. Like, there's probably just not a lot of people. So being able to have that community within the workplace is so comforting, to say, oh, this just happened to me. I know nothing's going to go anywhere, but I know that this person can relate to what I'm saying. And then it's just like, then being able to help those younger people. I just had a really good discussion with a young lady that works at Grand Tetons, and she is a young Native lady and really wants to work for the Park Service. And I just was really honest with her. Like, there's going to be days that is so tough, but you got to remember why you're here and why you want to do it. And it's those moments that we can provide that community. And that's the thing that I really like the most about our job. And then through this, where we were able to do this program today, is finding that commonality with what Hanako was going through, and be able to relate and say, yes, this is extremely unfair. How can we help each other? Those are those moments that are like, this is why it is so important and why we're here. And just kind of those things that you normally don't think of, other than payroll and nothing's burning down and like all that kind of important stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm a second-year PhD student, so it's I'm in a predominantly white institution. So Albert, I can definitely relate to your family being like, a political scientist, what the heck are you doing with political science and public policy? And I get asked if I'm going to be a politician, which nothing makes me want to vomit more than being the idea of running for office.
You can be chairwoman.
even I would say one of the things I cherish most about being and in my work with Hanako, especially learning the public history side of her work, is just learning our stories, learning from each other. And I'm so amazed by and Dorothy, thank you so much for bringing up that we need to work on advocating for our history from the Indian Wars on, right? Like, people who have been doing this work since, well, right, with our ancestors, but I think that there's not enough preservation of the stories of folks who are doing the work right now. And and I and Sarah Deer, who is a Muskogee Creek lawyer, works on, I work on mostly domestic violence policy, and I'm working on a study with missing and murdered Indigenous people in Idaho currently. I'm so amazed by the stories of, our service providers, our tribal domestic violence service providers, and the folks that hear the stories of our people of violence, on a regular basis, and who preserve those stories, who honor those stories, who tell those stories, who are they're the story carriers of our people. How little recognition sometimes they get, and so I'm here. I just really want to thank you all for being in community today, and to share a little bit of that story, and for allowing me to facilitate this conversation. From the moment we spent time together with Hanako, our first meeting together, I was just so honored that she would put us in a room together, and to be able to hear each other's stories is just is truly inspirational. And I hope that we can keep in touch. And that is all that we have for today.
We're supposed to say something. Hi.
I think we're waiting. We're looking for some questions, I suppose.
Let's see. I know we just had the one from B.B. Brigman that talked about how can white allies effect change at the National Park Service to help management better recognize and respectfully share these non-white history and honor sites of oppression, which I think is really a great question. And Albert had a response, so I'll let Albert talk first.
I think part of it was, being open and honest about either the site or the story that the site tells, and tell the entire story. If you don't know the entire story, do your research, and then interact and develop relationships with those non-white people who know the story, and then listen. A lot of the things within a lot of communities is that you listen, and that's how we learn. That's the one thing that I always tell people: is like, just be honest with the story, and tell the whole story.
Dorothy, did you want to respond?
Okay, there. I was looking for my mute button. One of the places I think that allies can go to is Illuminative. So it's ILLUMI and then native with a capital NATIVE.org. And they've done some comprehensive studies about the invisibility of Native people. And in response to the study that they did, they've also done additional reports about one that's specific to allies and what allies can do to help with that struggle and to help Native people become visible again. So there's a whole report there that I would recommend that people go take a look at that report. That's pretty good. And they also have a follow-up report as well on how Native people can do things to assist with telling the stories and getting those stories out there so that Native people are not invisible. And, you know, a huge part of it, I think, is the responsibility of the Park Service, because as you know, as America's storytellers, who else should be the ones to lead that than us at the various park units where we're able to tell those stories.
Alisha, do you want to add?
Yeah, just one thing I think to add as an ally is a lot of times the voices of Indigenous people aren't heard, and allies' voices can help open that door in that sense of being able to get that topic on the table, and then you have the people come in. So allies are very important in understanding that history and being respectful and knowing that things that are written down in books, not everything should be talked about at parks. So having that open dialogue and conversations with tribal partners is really important.
I always invite folks to Google or, do the reading and do it from, find the sources that the community uses to preserve that history, find scholars that community approves of and ask those questions, because we know who the storytellers are and what sources are important to us. And I know that that's also true for Japanese American in their preservation circles as well. There's important conversations to be had with those communities with permission and with in context and relationship to land and family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So far that's the only question that's come in. So we must have done a pretty good job with the initial part of the show. Yeah, so I know this week they're having, I think, about 4 or 5 different sessions on interpretive, like what can we do to change things within our interpretive programs. So if people have gotten in that invite, or please be able to to try to get to at least one of the sessions, so you can help with with telling these stories and bring it up that there's still a lot more that really needs to be told when it comes to working with Native peoples and the people that have been there. We're getting ready, when November is Native American month, and so we're getting ready to do different webinars and things during the month. And so one of them is going to be on land acknowledgements within the National Park Service. And so it'll be Albert, Alisha, Maya, who's the tribal liaison up in Alaska, and Malia from Hawaii, and just talking about the different perspectives of land acknowledgements. People right now, it's kind of almost like a fad that's going around, to do these land acknowledgements. But, the question you have to think about is, do you really need one? Do you want to do one? If you do, have you consulted with tribes? All that stuff. So I think it's going to be November 9th, and we'll be getting that poster out next week, so people can go ahead and sign up for that. But I think that's another critical part of how we begin to tell those stories. So.
Do you all have events coming up within your own, Alisha and Albert? Do y'all have events coming up for the November?
Just the one that Dorothy had mentioned. There's a few in the works, but we don't have any dates or anything right now. But when that is available, we'll be able to get that out and see if it's open to the public or if it's just within the National Park Service information kind of center. But that information will be coming out. We're hoping to do something talking about civil rights, the civil rights movement in the South, and how Native people played a part in that, because that's not something that is always talked about. And so we want to highlight that and have that information out there. And there's a lot of histories that are never taught in school or even in the Park Service. So we're really hoping to change that.
Okay, so there's a question that came in that I think Albert needs to respond to. From an archaeological perspective.
Well, from an archaeological perspective, we're all from Africa. We're all from the Rift Valley. I mean, that's where the matriarch of Homo sapiens sapiens came from. We're all originated from that specific mitochondrial DNA. We all have that part of us. If you look at the archaeological and the physical anthropology side of it, I don't doubt the Bering Land Bridge, but I also don't ascribe to it as the only theory. When you talk to tribal people within anywhere throughout the world, they refer to themselves as the people. They don't call themselves, anything else but the people. Are the people of the, whatever. Lakota or Pete were the people of the buffalo. And that is where our creation stories start coming from. Every culture has a creation story, whether it be Adam and Eve in the Judeo-Christian era, or even before that, whatever was before that. Like for myself, I know where my people came from, and they came from Wind Cave, which happens to be a national park. So, on the other science aspect of it, we were classified as Mongoloid in the 1960s version of human classification because we all have the blue dot, and we share that in common with Mongols. And so were we part of the Mongol hordes that ran through, Europe? I don't know. I think we're still over here in North America. In my language, we have words for three-toed horse. We have words for rhinoceros. I want to say furry rhinoceros, but we have some of these Pleistocene names that are still within the language, and so as an archaeologist, I can see it from one side, but as a Native American, I see it from a totally different side. And the whole reason I became an archaeologist was to match those two, and I have. In my opinion, there are certain places that I know of that speak truth to our stories from an archaeological perspective, and they're dating around 11 to 20,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the reasons I became an archaeologist. So I hope that answered your question. So yes and no, but yes.
Mm-hmm. But and we're talking about telling the stories of Native people in these places, And so when you go back to it, we have our the places that we came from. Wind Cave for Lakota, Nakota, Dakota people. I'm here at Grand Canyon National Park this week. At least two of the tribes have their emergence place within the Grand Canyon: Zuni, Pueblo, and Hopi. And I'm sure there's others because the Havasupai people are from within the Grand Canyon as well. So I think, when you go back to tell these stories, because we're at this level of the world at this time, then that's where you really should start, is where the people came into this world, and start there and go forward with those stories. But like I said, we're stuck, we're stuck in the past. And why is that? Why do people want to know, do you believe in the Bering Sea land bridge theory, rather than how can we help tell the story so that Native people are no longer invisible? How do we tell the story so that the 710 Native women who disappeared within the last 9 years in the state of Wyoming, their stories are told just the same as any other woman that disappears in the state of Wyoming today? We need to start focusing on the present and how it is that we can help tribal people to get those stories out.
Thank you, Dorothy. I always teased with Hanako. We always teased each other in college classes that we were land bridge cousins and that we were the connection. And I say that jokingly just because, Native people, we also have a practice of adopting, and we have practices that are rooted in relationships, and that family is, in Lakota, we have several words for family, and Albert brought up we're the people of the buffalo, but we also have our Tioshbe, and we also have our Tiwahe, and our Hunkapi, the people that we make it our relatives. And those are stories that hold a really important place in those migration movements and the ways that our people have always moved. And so, I've heard of Lakota storytellers making their way all the way to North Carolina and all the way to Mexico and, all the way up into Canada. And so I'd like to think that Hanako and I were cousins through the land bridge story, but mostly just because of our stories. Well, I think, I also don't see any more questions. But thank you again for participating with us, and we really appreciate this opportunity to be in community. Also, I just want to thank Dorothy and Albert and Alisha for their time. It's been such an honor to meet you all.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for having us on the panel and talking about, the different, or probably more what we have in common with some of the stuff, like with, the Japanese American, Asian Americans, and African Americans. Because one of the stories, one of our volunteers at Montezuma Castle and Tusigoot had gone on to get his master's degree and started really looking into some of the stories that the tribal elders at Yavapai Apache Nation that borders with the parks had talked about, and went back and really found out so much history about Native American slavery within the United States. And during the Indian Wars, they would kill, come in and massacre the tribal community that was there, the tribal unit that was there. And a lot of times, a lot of the younger children wouldn't have been part of that massacre. So then they would pick up those kids and they would take them into the local communities and either sell them to local families or just give them to local families. And they would then be raised as a slave for that family. And so, so that history also is part of the history that isn't really told and stuff. And so there's just so many different aspects and components of Native American history that can be told, along with all of this other stuff too. So, there's a lot of history out there, but then there's also contemporary stuff that we really need to start beginning to focus on.
Yeah, thank you. You know, one of the interesting things that I've gotten to do in my career has been being able to go to at least one internment camp when I was in Idaho, and seeing how that was created out in the middle of nowhere, and seeing the similarities of how it was platted, and then doing more research on it. One of the things in the Park Service that I personally do is I try to learn as much information as I can about a site that I'm working at or working near. And, you know, at that particular time, I was actually working on the Oregon Trail for a park and doing some delineations and some research for them. But there you go. Yeah. I forgot the one in Idaho. I thought it was Lakota word at one point, but it wasn't. Anyway, the one in southern Idaho. I started doing more research into that, and that was really surprising. The similarities that was shown when we first came back from Canada. When Sitting Bulls people came back from Canada, they were housed in a military fort, actually at Fort Buford by Fort Union, and then they were transferred down to Standing Rock, and then his people were dispersed. Actually, he wasn't. He was transferred all the way down to Fort Randall and spent a few years down there as a captive. But what happened was that we were held in containment, you know, and we were held in containment up until, you know, after World War II. I was having a discussion about traditional cultural properties and in the Indian country earlier today, and one of the things that the Park Service was famous for was saying, "Oh, it can't be on the National Register of Historic Places because you haven't used it continually for 50 years." And my response to them was, 50 years ago, if we would have left the reservation, we would have been shot as renegades. Plain and simple, you know. And that was within my grandmother's time, you know. And looking at how the setup was and seeing that the barbed wire around the internment camps faced in and the gun turrets faced in really hit home with me on that. And I was like, man, you know, I thought we had it rough. And being torn away from our homes and things like that, you know, it was just a whole another cycle of trauma that's happening to another group of people who did not deserve it whatsoever. And it was because they looked different than somebody else. Just like, you know, every other minority person, you know, in America at that, you know, at any time really. I mean, look at right now what's happening down on the border. Look at what's happening with the Haitians. You know, they're not even getting a chance to claim what's that called? Anyway, they're not getting a chance to come. Yeah, asylum. Thank you. I mean, getting a chance to claim asylum. They're just getting shipped right back. You know, is that what America's about? You know, or you look at, you know, the other southern part of the border where you have more indigenous people coming up, and they're getting turned around to border. You know, and people are dying today, and we're still doing that. The United States government is still doing that. You know, and so like Alisha said in the video, that some days it's hard working for the government. Seeing what they're doing and seeing that it's continuing to happen. So, that's kind of what I want to end it on. They're just, we've seen it. I've seen it. I felt it. Our stories aren't that different. And I hope that, again, as Alisha and Dorothy and Mel have said, that, that the future looks brighter for us. And I truly believe that. I believe that when we start taking ownership of our stories and we start telling the stories the way that they're supposed to be told, unfettered, unfiltered, unbiased, wow, a little bit biased, that we can seriously change the fabric of this country, and so that's all inclusive. Geez, I talk good.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll call it. Y'all are good. Good night.